The opinions expressed on this program are solely those of its hosts, guests, or callers, and do not necessarily represent the opinions of WTBR-FM, its management, other producers, or sponsors.
Welcome to Living Well into the Future with your host, Julie B Adler, where we introduce you to guests of all generations whose lived experience and expertise informs and stimulates us toward discussions and actions that foster living well ourselves and in our communities. We are grateful for the many comments we received about our last episode, Healing Art, which you can find wherever you get your podcast. We've received thanks from listeners for introducing them to the slow-looking technique of looking at art that Dr. Joel Katz and Brooke DiGiovanni Evans talked about. Others contemplating health issues investigated how the Healing Through Art programs discussed could help them. You can listen to that episode, this episode, and other past episodes through the WTBR-FM.com website and wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us and continue to write to us to let us know if their content gave rise to discussions or actions on your part. Let us know which episodes were relevant to your life, what you want to hear more about. You can reach us through our website, livingwellintothefuture.net, where you can get more information about our guests, show notes, and information about past episodes. Or you can write to us at lwitf22@gmail.com.
Thank you. I'm your host, Julie B Adler. Over the past several months, we've been exploring resilience from a wide variety of perspectives through community development, community justice, education, and in personal trauma and personal experience. In the last episode, we spoke about art from the focus of how it relates to us as viewers. In this episode, we're going to bridge our focus from reliance to our next topic, culture and community, with an episode in which we speak with the artists themselves. We'll dig deeper into the artistic process, the development of works of art, and how artists connect communities, communicate concepts that are both current and universal, and how they personally and through their art require and inspire resilience. Our first guest is Margaret Craig. To introduce her, I'm going to quote from the bio that she sent me. Margaret Craig received a degree in biology, secondary education, because mom and dad thought an art degree was a dumb idea. A BS in art and an MA in painting from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and an MFA in printmaking from the University of Texas at San Antonio followed. An innovator in printmaking techniques, she invented tar gel pressless etching, a cast acrylic process that allows for stretching artworks on a 3D surface. She is included in many public and private collections, including the Library of Congress. She is Professor Emeritus of Printmaking and Paper at the Southwest School of Art in San Antonio, Texas, a school that no longer exists. Her original college degree in biology has been a major influence in both the visual and ecological context of her work. Welcome, Margaret. You and I are acquainted from many classes that I took from you. So, Margaret, your bio says that the study of biology influenced your art. How?
It's influenced it in a lot of ways. First off, artists, you're trained to look at things, and it's really an exercise in how to see. And biologists is actually the same way, because you wind up, if you're studying a tree, you're studying how the tree branches and what its buds look like and what its flowers look like and all those kinds of things. And then eventually you're looking at that at a microscopic level. So they're not actually so far apart when it gets down to the study of things. Now, certainly, it has influenced me on so many levels, just from the basic observation of things. Spending a lot of time looking at things under the microscope, which is looking at the world in a way that you don't normally get to see as an artist. When you're doing genetics experiments with fruit flies, and you have to look at their eye color underneath a dissecting microscope, and you realize how incredibly beautiful these creatures are. And they're just pests in our normal life, but they're really quite incredible. Getting back to another way that science influences you is the means of experimentation. And science also requires a lot of resiliency and creativity. And you have to, first off, you think there's something out there, so you create an experiment to prove it. Does that experiment get proved all the time? No, sometimes it's disproved. So then you have to attack it from another aspect. And then when you think about scientists, sometimes I think it's almost worse for scientists than artists, because not only are we writing for grants, they're writing for grants just to be able to continue to do their research, whereas I need a room somewhere and I can paint, and I will figure out something to do with that.
Speaking of experiments, you mentioned in your bio, and is prominently featured on your Wikipedia page, you developed a particular technique through experimentation.
Yeah, the tar gel printing or the cast acrylic etching, yes, that was an experiment. I was required to develop curriculum for the Southwest School as head of painting, drawing, and printmaking there. And I was going to teach this acrylics class. We didn't have anybody who were particularly doing materials. And so I got a bunch of materials to start really playing around with this. And I came across this stuff called clear tar gel and started playing with that. And it was originally for spatter painting like Jackson Pollock, and it has a stretchiness to it. And that was the experiment that started that. But that isn't the only thing that at all that I've developed over the years. I did an awful lot and have demonstrated at conferences. And that's just the one that's probably the most unique and the one that I ran with the most because of what it gave me.
You have the skill to do, in terms of your art, both the finely realistic drawings, every single kind of bird in infinite detail and accurate color, and every wing correct. And now a lot of what you're doing, they're more amoeba-like, look more like what you would see under a microscope, perhaps.
Yes, that's very true. And I think when I started out doing my work as it developed after going to graduate school, and I was doing a lot of abstraction on things. So there's the highly representational stuff, but then it really became just about abstraction on these things that we don't normally see. When I started to do that, was really initially what I was thinking about. I think I'm not so excited about direct representation, and more interested about what's new, creating stuff that's new or different or playing with a form. I think the other thing is there's the sort of ecology of how things change. I took a lot of ecology classes when I was doing the biology, and that adds a different kind of concept. And that has really come out in kind of the later work where I'm talking more about these alternative evolutions of how the trash that we throw down on the planet, nature doesn't ignore that. Nature will go on, and that's a resource. Everything is grasping, everything is going to use this resource.
You worked on a smaller scale than you are working on in many instances now. You still go back and forth,
Yes.
but as this vision exploded over time to increase in size?
I think it probably started with what I call the tar gel etching, the cast acrylic etching, because I found instead of having to use a press, which is a very expensive bit of equipment, all of a sudden you don't have to use a press anymore, but just to play around with it, that was great. And then it turned out that it was a stretchy etching. So all of a sudden you have an etching that normally gets printed on a piece of paper. Paper isn't necessarily stretch. It has a tiny little bit of stretch to it. In fact, that's how an etching works when you run it through a press. And the damp paper embosses. So there's a stretch there, embosses and picks up the ink. With the cast acrylic printing, you have this medium that's running into all the textures on the etching plate and picking up that ink. And the wonderful thing about it is then I could stretch it on all kinds of forms. And I've always had a thing for sculpture. I even felt as an etcher, where you're creating this very shallow relief in a copper plate in order to create an image from it, that was a very shallow form of sculpture in a sense. So it was absolutely wonderful to take this. And not only did I not need a press for it, all of a sudden I could do it on things, put it on things. And I originally was making forms with it, styrofoam and plaster, and stretching things on it. And it's not on a huge scale, no. And then I discovered, I went out and actually bought plastic to manipulate with a heat gun. Mind you, bought plastic and put the stuff on there. And then all of a sudden I had the aha moment of like, why the hell are you buying plastic? There's so much out there. And then that is when things really broke for me. And that's when things started to increase in size, because I can stretch this etching on this. But of course, obviously, when I buy it, I can get a big piece of plastic. But when you're getting these smaller forms, then you build out of elements. And I think that's something that I almost learned. I remember when I had 3D design and we were asked to do an assignment where you create an element, the same element, and then you build with that. And that's what happened. I started building with these elements. They got bigger and then became the thing of, okay, now all of a sudden you say the medium is the message. It's all built on this recycled plastic. And of course, I've always had that bent, having taken biology and all these ecology classes. I had an environmental bent. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't pointed, because there is art theory and so forth. It's like you didn't want to be totally obvious about things. It's about contemplation, not necessarily about being pointed. And I remember when Luminaria started and I did the proposal for the first big performance piece for Luminaria, and here my piece about the environment made it to the front page of the San Antonio Express News.
Luminaria is a nighttime art festival held once a year at a different venue in San Antonio each year. We're speaking with Margaret Craig about how the size of her artwork went from wall size to human size and beyond.
And it suddenly became a means to reach people and not be preaching to the choir, because if you're just showing stuff in a gallery, chances are a lot of those people are already very educated. They are pro-environment and just generally progressive people. And then all of a sudden you're using your plastic and you realize it's mostly your plastic. Occasionally I had other people bring me things, but it's the apple containers from Costco. It's the kitty litter containers. It's the lettuce containers and all these things. It's the orange juice bottles that your stepson wants to, because that's the only kind of thing he wants to drink.
So tell me, the Luminaria Beast was the first one you did?
Yeah, that was the albatross. I did it 2016, and I created a life-size albatross with a belly full of plastic that I wore around my neck. And of course, references back to that phrase, the albatross around your neck, and the reference that we as human beings with all this plastic are creating an albatross around our neck and a penance we're going to be proverbially dealing with for a very long time.
So that was the first. And did that one have the tar gel?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. The albatross, not so much, because that was clear plastic that I put some white spray paint. So it was still translucent, and you could still see the lighted plastic in the belly. And then the back, if you looked at it, I had been creating before that trash reefs. I did an installation at Blue Star maybe a year or two before. That was called the Great Trash Reef. This, I now attached the trash reef to me and was pulling it behind me like Marley's ghost. So for another literary reference, you think all the sins, but yet it's all this nature that supposedly it's evolving. I mean, there's a little bit of optimism in the fact that nature is using it. And nature is using it. These evolutions that are happening from how we are changing the planet are not going to be necessarily what we want, but nature's going to use it. Nature isn't obliterated.
Up to this point, we've been talking about the work you've done in the U.S., but you've been the beneficiary of several residencies around the world.
Yeah, I've done residencies in Leeds, England, and I've done one or two in Italy, and I've done one in Upper New York State, and the most recent one was, of course, Iceland, and that was quite exciting.
So how do these residencies affect your art and the way you look at the art and the way you view how artists are valued or not valued in the communities?
Oh, I would say that Europe has a lot more value for artists than America. This is something I've observed. I look at it as an artist in America. People think that you're Van Gogh and you're going to cut off your ear. You're crazy. And I think what it comes down to is like, you have not embraced capitalism, therefore you're nuts. Because you're not going to make money like a doctor or business major. And so you're not going to support yourself. It goes back to that Puritan ethic. Yet real artists are the hardest working people I know, because you're not necessarily spending your evening playing video games. You can't afford to give into that, or you won't get anything done because you usually have to support yourself otherwise. In Europe, you find that there's more grants. Artists can actually survive. And once they reach a certain level, they can get grant funding. And there's not that here.
Iceland looked like a very creative time for you.
Yes. The nice thing about that is it was a funded residency. And that was wonderful because it was from people all over the world. And the whole idea was to create lighted sculpture in this little town that at the end of January, which is their darkest time of the year, that for a weekend they have this art exhibition and they drive around the town in their cars. It turned out it was like the worst weather that we had the whole time we were there, of course. But it was really wonderful to see the things that people came up with. And I created a trash reef, but I was using the plastic that came from there. They saved me plastic and brought it into the residency for me to use to create from that. And then I had a video image from my second performance there. So that was the creature from the Bleached Lagoon. So he was a video projection as part of the lighted trash reef with its bioluminescence. So it was a lot of fun. And there was also a lot of other wonderful, about 10 other pieces that were happening as part of this 2-day exhibition at the end of our residency.
And it was obviously well received. You also took the creature of the Bleached Lagoon to New York City.
Yes, I did. That was in a show a couple of years ago. And I took it up there as it was a show on the Brooklyn waterfront. And it was all about interaction with nature and the human beings who have been living there for a very long time, included the Native Americans. So this was New York and Brooklyn and cleanup and pollution. It's something they're constantly dealing with. So it was very fun to take that out as part of the show and do a performance on the Brooklyn waterfront there. So, yes.
It looks as if that it's now become a costume that you put on.
It is a costume. And I'm going to Salina, Kansas, and I'm going to do a residency there where I'm going to create the next piece, which is going to be called Twisted Twister. And that will also be something that I get inside and move around with and interact with people. And I'm going to debut that at their, and I've actually done the creature from the Bleached Lagoon at their Smoky Hill River Festival for a couple years in a row in June, last couple of years. So they really enjoyed that. And so we're going on and doing the next one.
And are these festivals and things that you've participated in, are they events that are they ecologically aware?
Yes, I would say definitely Kansas and Salina, Kansas is, of course, corn country and farming country. And they have to be very aware about their ecologies or they're not going to get their crops. Their crops aren't going to grow. So I think they are very aware. And it's the Smoky Hill River Festival. So it's talking about life in the rivers and streams. And it's an art and music festival. And they're very much about promoting art in their community.
So you have an audience.
I have an audience there. And just because the person who does the art for that fair is a printmaker, and she happened to see the creature when I did it in Madison, Wisconsin at the Southern Graphics Council International Conference. And I'm also going to be doing a new piece for the Southern Graphics Council International is having their big conference in Puerto Rico this year. And so I'm going to be doing a new piece there called Setting Seed, all about this ecology. So with this piece, it's a whole bunch of alternative evolutions. And then at a point in the conference, I'm going to go hide them around the hotel, and people have to collect these invaders so that they don't invade further, which also goes back to colonization and social issues as well.
On your website, there's a picture of you in the guise of one of your creatures, and people gathered around in New York City to feed it. We'll put a link to your website on our website so people can see your work. But right now, can you describe your creation?
It's a costume. So I get in there and my hands are operating it. In fact, one of the things we figured out to do is that I put red gloves on my hands so it looks like a tongue. And then people feed me plastic bottles. So I run around and say how hungry I am. I'm the creature, and feed me plastic and pollute more because I'm a monster. So it's funny. It's tongue in cheek. Kids and adults love it. And
you're making your point.
Yes, exactly.
And in fact, this year you were recognized by the San Antonio Art League as the Artist of the Year.
Yes, that was very nice. And so I put up a whole bunch of new work and old work. There was some old work there too, because it's a big space.
You've had a busy year. Another exhibit that your smaller scale work is in was organized by the City of San Antonio Office of Sustainability in the Department of Arts and Culture. That exhibit and the related events are great examples of the theme of our latest series, how art is interwoven into communities' needs and concerns, which has a bearing on our common future.
And it's called Resilient and Responsive Artists and the Environment. Did you find that your practice of art required or does now require resilience?
Yes. One of the things about being an artist is, and I'm even experiencing that even more so now, is constant rejection. Because you spend so much time, and right now in particular, responding to calls, to have shows, and that is now the other part of my job. And then you get rejected all the time. And if you don't have the strength within yourself to say, screw that, and go on to the next one, is okay, I don't get that, I'm going to go on to something else. And that was very much in the earlier part of my career too. Even just to get the job at the Southwest School, I applied to a lot of other jobs. It was not easy to get that art job with benefits. There's a lot of competition out there.
The city has done outreach through events which you've led.
Talk about what you've been asked to do and what the response has been.
One night we did a talk and we did a workshop for people to participate themselves using their own recycled materials. And it was well received. The show was well received. I was just so happy to see an organization being interested in this. I think I almost cried when I was asked to be a part of the show, just because, oh, someone's doing a show on this, which is how wonderful. And I was so glad to see that it was San Antonio that was making a point of this. And of course, I was thrilled to be included.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you think that people should know about art and resilience?
Art is rejected. Art was rejected by me. I was not allowed to pursue an art degree by my parents. Art is constant rejection, and you just have to do it and do it and do it. And of course, my parents were very proud of me. And at the end, that I did eventually get the art job with benefits and was a practicing artist. And they were my engineer father was very thrilled with that. Yeah. I think I'm an intelligent person, but I have a learning disability. And I think had I not had that learning disability, I would probably be a doctor and engineer now. The problem is it's very hard to really do serious science when 2 and 2 make 5 on a regular basis. And it's just this in your brain that just doesn't work for that. So I wouldn't wish me as an engineer.
Well, that is true resilience and finding what you are good at it. And
yeah, so I think that's probably why I was a printmaker, which I always say we're the science geeks of the art world, because it's all chemistry and it's all experimentation, because you're like, okay, when I put this through the press, this is what I think is going to happen. And then it doesn't happen. And you have to go back and reverse engineer. Okay, why didn't that work? And why did I get that all over the felts? Yeah, one of the things about art and helping people make art, and it is only art. It is art. It is not, it's not medicine. And it's not a bridge falling down.
However, it may have longer lasting effects.
Yes.
Societally. And
that's a wonderful thing that you say. I was taught that art doesn't have value. Talk about, I guess, my own resilience. I don't care if it has no value. I'm going to do it anyway. And I just love the fact that you just talked about how it probably has longer lasting effects. And of course, it does. What do we look at when we're looking at past generations of people? We're looking at their creations. We're looking at their art. And we're looking at their ideas and culture and how that is represented in their art. So there we go.
Thank you, Margaret, for speaking with us today. In this segment, we will turn to Ricky Armendáriz, another artist whose work connects to and fosters community. His work has been exhibited throughout the world and is held in many collections. It resonates with illusions that cross centuries, if not millennia. Here's an artist statement from Ricky Armendáriz's website. The artist was raised on the U.S.-Mexico border, a region that heavily influenced his artistic, aesthetic, and conceptual ideas. Images that have cultural, biographical, and art historical references are carved and burned into the surface of the paintings, drawings, and wood blocks. He received his Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Texas at San Antonio and his Master's of Fine Arts from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Armendáriz is currently a full professor at the School of Art, the University of Texas at San Antonio, where he teaches painting and drawing.
Welcome, Ricky Armendáriz, to Living Well into the Future. How are you today?
I'm excellent.
You have a style of art that is distinctive. How did you come to it? What is its genesis?
Early on, I was painting in sculpture class and I was sculpting in painting class. And I always benefited from having my professors be pretty open to what I created. And I joke that I was a collage artist, basically. And during the 80s, you could throw a rock and hit a Latino that was a collage artist. And I knew that I had to distinguish myself. I went to a particular grad school because there was an artist, Linda Harriet, who was painting and sewing and creating constructions out of fabric, and very similar to what I was doing at the time. And she was sewing. And so I went to go study with her, and she and I talked about my aesthetic and stuff. And she didn't say that it was necessarily bad. She just said, you got to do something with this. And my way of doing something was to leave it behind and completely start something new. And I was thinking about using text in my work, using language, both a mix of English and Spanish, because that was the way I grew up, as a way to both identify my work, but also poke fun of my work or poke fun of stereotypes. I approached it through a very self-effacing way of humor, right? And I used a lot of stereotypes, things that were very disturbing, I guess, at the time. And I was mixing it all up and putting it out there. In fact, when I was in grad school, I was doing this stuff that was so like over the top for me as a person and my personality, that I assumed a different identity to basically allow that work to be created and to be made, right? It wasn't me, it was El Pico that was making the work. I basically decided that I wanted to use text and I wanted to use the iconography of a landscape. And this was me redefining myself, right? I had this idea that I wanted to make conceptual landscapes. And landscapes are the thing of bad art, right? It's the thing of starving artist sales. It's like the thing your aunt does and hangs over the couch and it goes with the couch and all that. And I wanted to, in a sense, rejuvenate that. And maybe that's why I was interested in conceptual text-based work. And so I made up all of these phrases that were referencing song lyrics. And they were a mix of both English and Spanish. So sometimes I took contemporary music, like pop songs. The lyric, I should have known by the way you parked your car sideways that it wouldn't last. It's the opening line of Little Red Corvette, Prince. Or no necesitan un weatherman, sabes que which way the wind blows, Bob Dylan. And so you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows.
At that time, were you using the method that you have adopted now with the large wooden, essentially canvas, but it's wood, and then incising into it and painting over that? Is that what you still do?
Yeah, that's all I do now. I carve, I paint very traditionally in oils, and then after the painting is nice and dry, I carve the wood.
What?
I work in a lot of different disciplines. I work in a subtractive method. So anything that's subtractive, like when I'm carving, like I'm literally carving the wood, right? And then you ink it and you put paper on it. And then and I'm working on a really large commission right now for the Alamo, actually. It's 10 feet by 20 feet. This thing is so big that it takes up half of my entire studio. I barely have room to walk around it.
Do you have assistance with a project that big?
I would love assistance, but I have kept my operation pretty small because I don't work well typically with others, but there's certain processes that I know I don't do. I don't print my large work, my real large work. I don't print it well. So I'm happy to work with a master printer to print my work. I am happy to have an amazing photographer photograph my work. Certain processes I know I'm not good at, so I allow others to help. But other processes that are within my wheelhouse of skill set, I like to do.
You have said that you are dyslexic. And at what point did that turn out to be a skill and a benefit? And what resilience was required to get to that point?
In the beginning, it was really challenging. And I think that getting back to the idea of resilience, I needed to do this because I knew that going forward in academia was the only option for success for me. Back then, 20 years ago, even more, curators that I spoke to, professors that I spoke to, they absolutely said, you need your terminal degree to be part of a museum collection. So it was absolutely a thing I had to have to succeed. And so that it wasn't an option. I had to figure out a way to get through all of these things. Now it's a strength, I think. Now it's a strength because I feel that I work in a way that only I'm able to focus on the very important things that I need to do and not get distracted by the minutia of a lot of other things that are around me.
Is that an aspect of dyslexia?
I think that what it does is it causes you to stay creative, stay in that creative space, and not have to focus on things that you can compartmentalize and leave till later. So yes, it's maybe a little bit part of dyslexia, but it's also a part of just trying to stay focused on a certain thing, on a certain task that you like that. Those are some of the skills that I learned like early on in college to stay focused on a certain task and get that task accomplished. And then you're able to check that box and then move on to the next thing. So that was very important to me.
Can you talk about myth in your art, where it derives from?
When I was young, I have some early memories of going to the El Paso Museum of Art. This is not the same beautiful museum that we have now. It was a small little colonial looking building, and all of it was artwork that was European, old, dead, white guys everywhere, right? Marble busts, old paintings of people in their salons and stuff like that. And so for me, that was art, right? But they did have artwork that portrayed Greek and Roman mythology, right? There was images of Zeus and Io and Aphrodite and these compositions were full of flora and fauna, like very dense compositions. And I was very attracted to that early on. I work in multiple series at a time, and I took a break from the landscapes for a bit, and I started doing, again, sunrises and sunsets, but I started carving imagery that was more referential of mythology. And I was learning in art history, and I was internalizing it, scrambling it up the way we do on the border with both English and Spanish and pop culture from Mexico and English pop culture, and then trying to find a new way to both use humor and self-effacing humor to talk about difficult subjects, talk about how the machismo individual, it's a fate worse than death to have your children usurp you. And so I was thinking about all those things, but I was thinking about it through the lens of Saturn. And so I really thought that people could relate to it. Even if they didn't know what like machismo is, they could relate to that early on. And I've got my own theories for why we used and hung on to that iconography for so long, but I feel that it was a good way to use animals as surrogates to talk about contemporary situations, things that were biographical, things that were political, things that were cultural. And I could use an image of Saturn and his children, and I could talk about the idea of getting older and your children running all over you and usurping you down the road, and you being fearful of being like ending up like weak against the power of your children and all these things.
They are images that have been used throughout the world.
Yeah. I used to think that certain cultures own certain images, right? And I know now because I'm more traveled now as opposed to the way I was when I was younger. I know that the Inuit don't own the whale, right? I know that the Northern Indian doesn't own the bear, right? The Southern Indian doesn't own the coyote. And so what I have found in my travels and exploring the mythology of other cultures, that we, and I say we, the collective we, right? We bear more similarities than we do differences. But I will tell you that most of the time, Coyote is usually somebody who's dissatisfied with the gifts he's been given by his creator. He's always dissatisfied. And I tend to use Coyote a lot in my imagery. I oftentimes he's representing Prometheus, the god who gave man fire, right? Which is the symbolism of knowledge. I do all of this mind mapping, this with my ideas. I'll come up with an idea and I'll put it in the center of a page, and I'll diagram away from it all the different connectivity to mythology, to the border and border issues, politics that are happening right now, but personal biography. And I'll create this like giant web of connectivity so that I can figure out how all of the different puzzle pieces fit together. And so I'll look at mythology like the bear or coyote, and I'll go, okay, what is it called in a different culture? What are the stories in a different culture? Where are the parallels of that story by the Lakota people? And how does that parallel to the Mexica people or the Aztec people? How does it relate? And so I'll bring that in, and then I'll also bring some of my own personal biography in, and then I'll combine different mythologies together in the same composition. So you have 2 or 3 different things that are happening, like different mythologies colliding, like where there's a story in between this mythology that's known and that mythology that's known. And then I make up the story in between. And so I do that a lot as a conceptual framework for the work I make.
You mentioned that you are now well-traveled. You've had several residencies. You did the Berlin residency, and where else? Mexico City, and then Anderson Ranch. What did you get from it in terms of seeing your art accepted or interpreted in other cultures?
When I start talking about this idea of connectivity, and I mentioned the conceptual idea that I'm working with, I definitely get a look of recognition or a look of understanding. And I think that a lot of my work, going back to some of those early references to colonial work or a Renaissance painting, a lot of different, especially Europeans, they tend to resonate with that. And if I start making compositions very dense with floral and fauna, they tend to have an aesthetic connection between what I'm making and what was made 500 years ago. I'll talk about specifically the Berlin residency, because I went with a plan. I got the residency because I said I was going to make work about the border. The wall came down. I was alive. I'm old enough to know that and saw the wall come down. And I thought they had a border. We have a border. They have border issues. I have border issues. So when I went, I thought that's what I'm going to make work about. And immediately everything changed, because it's less interesting to me to talk about black and white. It's more interesting to talk about nuanced, complicated things that both sides share and the commonalities of those things, rather than talk about dichotomies. And I will tell you that when I made work about Greek and Roman iconography or the pre-Columbian iconography. By the way, Europeans love they seem to be really fascinated with Mexican Indians and indigenous people. They're just really very interested in the kind of imagery and the kind of aesthetics that are used by indigenous people. And I borrow a lot of those kind of fastidious marks that I make from Huichol and Mola artwork. Indigenous art was hanging on my wall growing up, right next to artwork, like real artwork, right next to kitschy artwork. And so all of that stuff gets mixed up, right? And so when I'm in Germany and I'm doing things, I did a print project where I told you I shifted gears. I was doing these giant tanks. So there's this giant. I saw physically these German tanks. They're in lots of monuments in Berlin, and I saw the parallel right in Texas, like all over the Panhandle, like around Fort Bliss, and all the parks had these decommissioned war machines that probably ended people's lives. And now, ironically, they're decommissioned and little children are playing all over these things. And as a kid, I remember climbing on tanks and getting into decommissioned planes and playing on these things. And so I saw a lot of that over there. And so I thought this is way better than just strictly talking about border. And so I started doing these German tanks, and my dad and I, when I was young, the way we spent time together, quality time, we made models. And so I made models of usually World War II planes and tanks and things like that. So I saw all of this stuff in their monuments, in their playgrounds. And so I thought, oh, this is perfect. So I did these really large tanks, huge. They're like 36, maybe 40 inches by 48 inches, huge.
And you were able to get the wood that you needed.
That was a challenge. And I went and got wood at the lumber yard, and I carried it on the subway. So I carried like giant 4-foot by 8-foot pieces of plywood on the subway. They were very annoyed with me. So I had this tank. I met a printmaker that was willing to go on this journey with me, because everybody was like, stay away, because nobody likes to do big things. And this thing was huge. Like, it's bigger than most people print. And I met this printmaking group that had this giant old 100-year-old printing press, beautiful, the size of an entire room, gorgeous. They were willing to print this thing, and I printed it. And so after it got printed, then my idea shifted. I thought, everywhere in Berlin, there is graffiti, like graffiti everywhere, like everything from 6 feet down on almost every building, especially in Pittsburgh, which was where I was stationed at the Kunsthaus Britannien. I saw graffiti everywhere. So my idea was to commission a graffiti artist to graffiti my artwork. And I couldn't get anybody to do it. I couldn't get anybody to take me seriously, that I was willing for them to, in essence, ruin my artwork. And nobody would do it. All I had time for was to produce a bunch of these things. And I worked on a couple of other blocks that were unrelated, more the mythology stuff. And then I brought the blocks home, and I hired a graffiti artist here in San Antonio to graffiti them. Yeah, Christopher Montoya was the graffiti artist that I hired here. And
so you didn't want to do it yourself. You felt it wouldn't have been the same.
Like, I didn't want to fake it. Like, I didn't want it to look like it was like a caricature of graffiti. I wanted it to really be graffiti. And so all I did was I gave him these prints, and I didn't give him any instruction, and I get them back. And he had taped out, get this, he taped out the tank. And so everywhere around the tank, it was graffitied. So in essence, it ended up looking exactly the graffiti in Berlin, where you have graffiti on the walls that is all a mishmash of all these things. And then somebody comes and wheat pastes like a poster on top of the graffiti. So even though the print came first, what looks like happened is that the tank is laminated on top of the graffiti. And it came out beautiful. I love these things. Like, getting back to what you were saying, how was it received? Like, they were ecstatic, like, at how I interpreted their culture and internalized that, spat it out through my mythology, my own personal mythology, through the tanks. I connected back with the print shop that did my work for me. And they were really surprised at how the print had changed in the transition from them to me.
We've talked about your art, your process of creation, and the reaction to it. One point we haven't discussed is the role that art plays in bolstering communities.
I feel that that my role is vital. A long time ago when I was in grad school, I thought I would be known for my work, even though my work is in museums, right? My work is in collections. I feel that the real mark that I'm going to make is raising an army of artists that somehow think like me. Like they question things in the way I question things. And this isn't like I didn't get it out of the air. I am basically parroting and or transcribing in my own way what my professors gave me, right? To question, do you really believe that? I had a professor, Dr. Francis Colpitt, wonderful art historian, would say to the class, it doesn't matter if she was on board with your ideas. She would ask you, like, do you really believe that? And so it would really force you to validate and defend and reevaluate your position on everything. And I want my army to go forth and make other armies and to change people's perception of what art is, and that it can be both economically viable and conceptually and culturally enriching. It can do both. And ultimately, our history as America, unless it's economically viable, then we don't accept it. And if it's both, then a larger population will deem it worthy to coexist with other disciplines.
Is there issue orienting? Are there social issues that are addressed through the art department that is working toward making art a viable career for more people?
I would think so. Just when I got hired 20 years ago, all of the artists and the art historians, with the exception of one, were white. All of them. Okay, mostly men, few women, and one Latino, Dr. Jacinto Chiarte. That was true also of my undergrad. Okay, it was true of my grad and it was true of my undergrad. In grad, it was Dr. Jorge Rivera that was my example. I think just in terms of representation, first-gen students and people of color can look to a diverse faculty and understand that they're represented, their ideas are valid. And all of that is really important. If you don't have role models, you don't have any guiding principle or light, right? You have no direction or very little affirming, what's the word, complementary direction. All of that, I think, is very helpful. As far as our department is concerned, making our profession more viable as a profession, being an artist as a profession, teaching those professional practice classes, teaching the business of art, teaching, like I used to teach a class that taught students how to do their taxes, how to price their work, what kind of relationship you have with your gallery, what should you ask for, what kind of relationship should you have with your studio or studio assistants, right? And so all of these things make it a little bit more viable and a little bit more accessible to students who are graduating nowadays. Has it always been that way? No. But culturally, we're dissolving the giant cold iceberg that prevents a lot of creative people from following this creativity to be able to support themselves and to also stay creative in their life.
That is fantastic. And I think with that, we'll end the discussion. Thank you for speaking with me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Julie. This has been fun.
In this episode, you heard Margaret Craig and Ricky Armendáriz dig deeper into the artistic process, the development of works of art, and how they connect communities, communicate concepts relevant currently and universally, and require and inspire resilience. In our next episode, Our thanks from me, Julie B Adler, to Berkshire Alley, WTBR-FM 89.7 Pittsfield, and the Berkshire Eagle for their support.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode and found food for thought and further discussion with family, friends, and the wider community. If you want to repeat this episode and hear others, you can find them at Living Well Into the Future on 89.7 WTBR Pittsfield, 88.1 WSBR Lee, WTBR-FM.com, Apple Podcasts, and other streaming services. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. We invite you to contribute to Living Well Into the Future with your comments and suggestions for topics and even guests. Write to us at lwitf22@gmail.com or through our website at livingwellintothefuture.com, where you can find show notes, past episodes, and information about our guests.
This podcast is produced by Julie Koppenheffer. Our music is written and performed by Michael Koppenheffer. The opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and not of WTBR-FM, Berkshire Alley, or the Berkshire Eagle, or the LWITF production team.